Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at the classical mystical path as it's seen through what is sometimes called the Perennial Philosophy or the primordial tradition. My guest is James Tunney, who is the author of The Mystical Accord, Sutras to Suit Our Times, Lines for Spiritual Evolution. He is also the author of 2 dystopian novels, Blue Lies September and Ireland, I Don't Know Who She Is. He is a qualified barrister and has taught law throughout the world. He's also a fine artist. Welcome, James.
Thank you again, Jeffrey.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I know you take a lot of your inspiration in looking at the mystical path from the writings of Aldous Huxley.
Yes, I didn't revisit Aldous Huxley until after I had done the work, and I began to look around for similar statements in context. I'm not quite sure at the end of Aldous Huxley's life about what his vision of the future was for him, that he wanted for society. But in relation to the perennial philosophy, my disposition is the same.
Well, he wrote The Perennial Philosophy.
Yes.
I was also myself greatly influenced by Huston Smith, who wrote a similar book called The Primordial Tradition. And the idea behind both of these books is that if you study the great mystics, spiritually realized people from all cultures, you can see that they are experiencing a common unity. Some people say, there are many paths up the mountain, but it's all one mountain when you get to the top.
Yes. I agree with that. My view is that for people genuinely following most spiritual paths, excluding strange cults or whatever on the side, on marginal, but looking at the main traditions that have been around for a long time with great discipline and great history and great evolution, we see the same general path of evolution. So what I suggest is that there is a kind of simple structure I've articulated in my terms as a structure for my lines on spiritual evolution. Mm-hmm. So what's the relevance of that? My point or idea would be that there are a lot of people who have felt abandoned by the institutions, but they realize that they're spiritual beings, but then they're not quite sure what they're meant to do or where they're meant to go. What I would suggest is that there is some indication from looking at the different mystical traditions of some type of path. Now, it doesn't mean that everyone is going to go all the way on that path, but it helps them to understand what other people were doing within the traditions, and also may give them a map to say, well, these are the things I have to work at. And in fact, all of the different elements kind of go in parallel. So it's not laid out clearly in some senses, but there is a structure, and there's a circularity or a chirality about the process.
Mm-hmm. So. Well, I know in the case of Aldous Huxley, he was close friends with the writer Christopher Isherwood, who became very involved in the life of Sri Ramakrishna and the teachings of Vedanta, the classical yoga path, which many people are engaged today in the path of yoga, although not everyone understands the philosophy behind it.
No, and yoga had very serious mystical and spiritual dimensions to it, and perhaps that's why we hear debates, and they annoy me now when I hear certain Christians say, "Oh, this is anti-Catholic yogic practice," or I know serious Catholics who have said to me that the martial arts are anti-Catholic. I find no basis for that in anything. That I never heard Jesus saying anything against yoga, but people are willing to put their own judgment above any other counter-indication. And yoga is very important in the Western terms to align the body, to get the body correct, and to put one into a different dimension without all the other elements, because a lot of people are not particularly aware of the other element, but it's still important. And when you get into this, I've even heard it recently in relation to Vedanta. I've heard some practitioners saying, well, this is the only thing you can get. You can only get it in Vedanta. So you have this exclusivity and territoriality, which in my view is inappropriate for genuine seekers, because you can learn and be informed from the different traditions. So it's a similar thing in relation to martial arts. I believe martial arts are very important very useful for people to develop their ego development, their ability to defend themselves. But there's a very deep dimension to it that's worth studying. And after I leave New Mexico, I'll be going to Colorado, and I'll meet up with my former karate sensei, and we're going to we'll probably be doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu more this time and concentrating on that. But he's a high-level black belt, but not only is he a high-level black belt who has he's done a PhD comparing accountancy and Western thinking with a Taoist perspective, which is quite interesting. But he would have a very deep understanding of what the karate do means. The do, it's the same as I do a bit of judo as well. So judo means the gentle way. So judo was not meant to be merely about throwing people. It's very effective for that. I recommend it to anybody. But behind it, the founder, Kano, who founded judo, believed that the students should be doing calligraphy and they should be educating themselves about culture. And it was a holistic spiritual path. Those bits get cut out, and you get left with the bit which is only part of the whole story. Mm. So it's important to look respectfully at other traditions, to learn whatever tradition you're used to. People often criticize and say, well, you were born Jewish, so you shouldn't be, it's easy for you to whatever, or you were born Catholic, it's easy for you. But you should learn in your own tradition and have respect for others and change as appropriate as people do. I've always liked the Quakers, for example. I think that they have something to offer that is quite unique, and they've shown that in relation to their business practices. Mm. So this idea of coming out into the world and doing things differently. Cadbury's, Schweppes, Bourneville, historically, they had a basis and a philosophy that emerged from a spiritual path. So.
These are businesses established by Quakers.
Yes, yeah, they have, and also they have a history of treating their workers better historically. Mm-hmm. And for example, during the Irish famine, they were one of the groups that actually helped people, and they're kind of remembered for that. And at the same time, there was a lot of I think Ernest Shackleton, if I'm not mistaken, the great explorer, came from a Quaker background. You know, so they weren't ignoring the real world. In fact, their spiritual background helps them deal with the real world, and also they advocate a very direct connection between the individual and the higher authority without interventions.
Now, I have often heard it said that the mystical people with any given religion have more in common with each other and from different religions than they have in common with the more orthodox from their own faith.
I'd believe that to be true. Mm-hmm. I'd believe that to be true. The only distinction I would make that if you look at, say, Judaism, there's a lot of very, very distinctive and unique paths in that I don't think you'd find elsewhere. For example, so only on that basis, only that exception that there are some that are they're so evolved and so specific that well, but I agree with the proposition. Yes, is the answer.
I'll tell you, because I have had the privilege of interviewing many great rabbis, many great swamis, Sufi masters. One who I was particularly close to was Rabbi Zalman Schachter, who was well known as a Hasidic rabbi, a very devout Orthodox Jew, but he felt quite comfortable going into a Muslim Sufi community and praying with them.
Of course, I find Sufism is very easy for me to understand, to identify with what I can say. Here's an example which is a terrible example of the opposite of that. And this is where the dogmatists get in. As far as I remember my father saying that when he was younger, the church would not allow them to attend the funerals of their Protestant neighbours. So they weren't allowed, so they were only allowed by their own church to stay outside and not enter the church. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that when the first president of Ireland died, that most of the cabinet stayed outside because they were paying attention to the wishes of the institution, which I think is morally offensive, and there's no justification for that. So that kind of territorialism is totally inconsistent with the spirit of the religious practice. And interesting, Douglas Hyde, that president, was also a folklorist. The first president of Ireland was a folklorist who used to go out and collect stories, and who also wrote, if I'm not mistaken, an introduction, a foreword to Walter Evans-Wentz's Fairy Folk of the Celtic Lands, the person who went on to write the Tibetan, or translate the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Yes.
And also, Douglas Hyde mentions that when he was a boy, in a field, he saw a horse transform into a woman. He had it's quite incredible. But anyway, the point being that there's a territorialism, that the spirit of the religion is gone. There's nothing in the spirit I can see of Christianity that would say, on some doctrinal grounds, you're not allowed to attend the funeral of a different religion. So yes, of course, the rabbi will be very comfortable and recognize and be respectful and learn and enrich his or her tradition from it.
Well, you're bringing up a crucial issue, which I guess I would say it relates to the notion of discipleship, because many traditions say that the only way you're going to evolve into a deep spiritual path is if you have a guru, a teacher, someone who has already realized, who can help you. You'll never get there on your own. But I know from our previous conversation, you have suggested, we had a beautiful conversation on the question of globalism, and you made a point that you don't endorse individuals giving up their own personal sovereignty to some institution or organization.
No, I don't. I don't believe that the concept of submission that's emphasized by the Jesuit order, for example, to take that one, or is emphasized in a number of religions, the idea that you submit to authority 100% is necessarily the best way to do it. I'm very, you have to be careful, and every individual has to be careful about being drawn into cults, and they have to be careful that they're not pulled in by psychological, by cheap means, or by the power and charisma of a person who's not necessarily a spiritually involved person, but may have very strong mental powers associated with their ego, etc. So the guru point is appropriate in relation to particular traditions, but not all traditions have this idea of the guru, and the idea that it's inevitable depends on the context. For example, obviously, if I start off as I have in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I have to be humble and learn off everyone, because I can see and they can demonstrate, and it's very testable when I roll with them whether they're superior to me or not. When you're starting, everyone is superior to you. So it's very, very clear that you have to learn off the people. But it doesn't mean that the person takes away the sovereignty of they help you. It's a dynamic relationship. And take the amount of interviews that you have done. That provides a store of information that's available for people to access, which is a substitute in some way of having someone to tell you, because it wasn't available for people previously to get access to such information. This
was considered hidden. Now it's all over YouTube.
Exactly. So I'm skeptical of that, and it's also this idea that now that doesn't mean that people don't need assistance if they're in a religious tradition. Well, obviously there is a hierarchy in that, but again, you don't have total. We're not meant to have total trust in people. In fact, it's a good thing to be mistrustful of authority in general.
And in my experience with people who have submitted to a guru, there often comes a time where either the guru is going to push you out, or you're going to decide for yourself you've had enough, it's time to move on.
Yes, yeah. And It depends on, I've heard Ram Dass talk about his experience going to India, and there are different contexts, and some contexts are very specific. And if you're talking about meeting a person who, by almost any standard, is evolved spiritually, that's a different thing than meeting certain other individuals. So the obligation is still on the individual, and nobody that we know of really has superiority over your spirit. And I don't see any doctrinal basis that says that a person who is at the pyramid of a hierarchy of human-made things really has power over your spirit, because that's the antithesis of what most of the religions say, that your only obligation is towards the higher force. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't make sense to me. And there is this danger all the time of this interposition of other people's ego to stop your spiritual path. They don't have control over it in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other issue in everybody on a spiritual path has to come to terms with is dealing with their own ego issues.
Okay, perhaps I could explain the structure that I utilized in a simple way as a superstructure. It might explain or address some of these issues. And again, I wrote the lines within this context. But I start from the idea, and I'm not claiming this is original. It reflects a lot of traditions. There's elements that I have that are original of the structure. But to make it simple, we say we start off with a self. We grow up, our ego expands. So we start off, and our ego expands and grows and accumulates different elements. And then at a certain point of time or maturity, we come to realize that, we may not be quite happy with ourselves, or there's other things, not always, but for people who are on a spiritual quest, they want something more. The things around them are not giving them that meaning. They don't have a sense of peace. And then they begin to focus. So the person on the spiritual quest then begins to move towards something which is called the true self. Now, the true self would be consistent with your pure consciousness. So again, in the Vedanta, Vedanta non-dual idea, it's funny that when you hear non-dualists talk, they always start talking about dualism. It's an interesting phenomenon when you're talking. But so the idea being that we have this self which grows, and that self, I call that the false self to distinguish it from the true self, is the personality, the thing in the external world, the construct, a thing that has grown to suit the circumstances of our experience. And that we have to begin to turn away from that and look inside. And the idea is that inside we have it. It's there. It's there from the start. You are that pure consciousness. It's there already. So you don't have to work to find it. You have to do it to do it. But that's not the end of the story. So before that, there is an idea that you do have to accept that you're a spiritual being in some sense. You do have to accept that you have consciousness in you. And I think that the extra dimension to help that process is to understand that consciousness is fundamental. Now, we don't know that. We can't say that. There's a lot of evidence, or there's a lot of people who would oppose that view. But we see that all the spiritual traditions say that consciousness it doesn't grow in the brain. It's not like something that can be squeezed out. It's not emergent in that sense. It's something that's pre-existing. So that's consistent, as we said, as we talked about, with ideas in science, that consciousness is pre-existing. It comes into us. That is the true self. We add things on. So the true self is going back and is beginning to discard things. So it gets more back to the consciousness. And in doing so, it creates a sense of peace associated with that. So that's one element of it. In parallel, or even if one ever reaches that stage, there are further elements. There is the element of the journey. The journey is in every tradition in some shape or form. If you look back at the early Christian texts in Ireland, it was a literal journey, like St. Brendan going on it manifests.
It'd been a pilgrimage, for example.
Pilgrimage is a classic example. We see it in all the stories that Campbell talks about, and myths and going somewhere.
The hero's journey.
Yeah, we see the hero's journey. It's the same thing. The journeying for something to get some, but it's not to get some prize. It's to get some spiritual enlightenment. And I think the word light as well is an important word. Light has with two elements in relation to light and the origin of a lot of life, but also in not being heavy. And I remember when I met Dennis McPherson, who was an Ojibwe activist who had walked a big long walk to deliver a letter of protest to the then Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, and he was protesting against the treatment of Ojibwes in Canada. And I remember the phrase because I was in his office, and he said that your law, Prime Minister, is heavy on my people, but Ojibwe law is light in my heart. And I think that idea of lightness is important. So the journey is the journey of growth. Now, that could mean a lot of things for different people. It could mean, for example, I see people who care for other people. They sacrifice elements of their life to look after people who need assistance. And that might be the journey for individuals, because it demands great willpower, courage, perseverance, and compassion. Self-sacrifice. And there's an element, so the journey doesn't have to be a trip to Hong Kong or going to the East or so sometimes there's too much emphasis on this idea of going to something exotic. That's not necessary. It's an inner journey. Yeah. So all these journeys reflect the inner journey. As going back to Berkeley, that the inner world is huge, and this is an illusion that we fail to see. And people say, well, go in where? What's in there? If you don't have any conception of something inside, it makes it more difficult. That can be a mental block. But if you look at people like William Blake, the great poet and artist and writer, who used to see angels from the time he was a child, who was very critical of the evolution of the industrial society, who was very critical of science, very critical of the treatment of Africans in London, of children in London, very critical of the satanic mills. So he said that he described it as imagination. So not just imagination, how you make something, but that the world is imagination, and imagination is more important than experience. So that's again consistent with kind of Berkeley's idea, but it also brings the attention back that the inner world is very, very rich, and one has to believe that for a start and engage in it. And that has to be, I can't make an inner journey for you. That journey has to be personal. It has to be a journey that you do. So a person may be able to guide you, give you some direction, but the journey is something that you have to do. It's a personal, individual thing. It can't be given to someone else to make on your behalf by substitution or ritual or whatever change. So the journey aspect is parallel or part of this process.
Well, you're reminding me of a phrase from T.S. Eliot, where he says, at the end of all of our journeying, we arrive at the place where we first started, only to recognize it for the first time.
That's right. So you're here, you're looking out, you're going out, is it over there? Is it over there? In the Gospel of St. Thomas, again, it says that, looking everywhere, and they say, look over there, look, but it's not, it's in there, you have it. So it's about looking inwards, and in particular to the heart, to the idea of the central energy, which is based on, again, compassion is the key thing. I can't get away from that. There's no other word. It's the best word to describe the central thing. So the compassion is both a starting point and a point to head to. Yeah. So the compassion is a guiding star as well. So if actions or courses are inconsistent with that, in my view, it'll be the wrong path.
I think it's that sense of compassion that makes the various mystical seekers from different religions feel a kinship with each other more than they feel with the orthodox of their own faith, because often the orthodox are very judgmental.
Well, as far as I understand it, Jesus Christ's greatest criticism was for the legalists, the people that had become focused on details and the focus on details to the detriment of the spirit that motivated the endeavor. So
I think they were known as the Pharisees back then.
The scribes and the Pharisees. That's correct. So that attitude is everywhere. Now, there is a bit of a problem in that, and I wonder about the psychology of this, because some people's minds may not be able to conceive that. Their minds may be, I wonder about how a person's mind is formed, so they can't actually see the spiritual bit. It may be that some people find it more difficult, but certainly there's other people who will hold on to the doctrine because it's easier. They don't have to do the other things. It's more predictable. They can exercise power. So those reasons may be more significant. But yeah, absolutely. And they've also will have gone through the same pathway. So they're going to recognize people who, and also they should have a bit of humility. It's the same in the martial arts thing, that the people at the top usually have a lot more humility than people there. It's a kind of paradoxical situation. And that's all. It's not necessarily the case, but it's often the case with the higher level martial artists, or people. And this is another, I think, of Maslow.
Abraham Maslow.
Yeah. So, I mean, he was very interested in peak experiences, which is in the same domain as mystical experience.
Yes, indeed.
And two things that he noticed: one, that people who have attained those experiences are reluctant to talk about. They don't really want to necessarily share it to someone like him, who's a scientist. And I think that's very wise of them. That was very wise of them to be careful. So it was difficult to get people sometimes to tell them the exact nature. But in as far as I understand it, in the latter part of his or the end of his career, he was focusing on plateau experience, and the idea that you come to it doesn't go up and then down. That when you reach a certain level, there's a plateau at a higher level, which I think is a correct description of spiritual evolution.
Well, one thing that really impressed me is the idea I've seen in Buddhism, Zen Buddhism in particular, that the simplest things in life can be the most profound. I think the phrase they use is chopping wood and carrying water.
Yes. I have a view, and I think back sometimes. Now, I know I'm not going to glamorize the past or glamorize rural Ireland. I say it was great when there was loads of problems that we don't want to, we wanted to change as well. But sometimes watching people in different societies doing simple things, making bread, concentrating on the thing, 100% concentration, 100% present, doing something useful, creating joy, sharing it. Why isn't that as important? And certainly bread is a very powerful spiritual symbol. So I agree with that. I don't think it has to be, oh, look at me, I can levitate, and you look very serious, and you talk in strange language. I don't think that's what it's about. And I think some of the the highest spiritual leaders will be people that will not get a second look by anyone around them, and they will seem to blend into the background. And funnily enough, that parallel is also in relation to magicians, because if you talk to people in the esoteric context, they realize that the highest person in the particular discipline may be the person who is this sweeping or cleaning, and that's also the idea, I suppose, in Christianity, that you don't know who you're dealing with. You can't make judgments and with the external appearance. And sorry.
Well, we have a real tendency in our social life to judge people by their external attainments.
Yes, and this is if we say it's a journey, when a person is on the journey, whatever metaphor you want to take, ships or boats or all the walking or going up, climbing mountains, there's some type of metaphorical journey. And on this journey, from the spiritual traditions, there's two types of things that characterize the journey. There's distinguishing between reality and illusion. That's an important thing. What is real and what's not real. And real in this sense is not in the evolutionary sense. It's what is of real value and what is not of value in relation to the spiritual quest. You can see that in a number of novels. Silas Marner by George Eliot, for example, where the miser loses his gold, but he gains a daughter with the golden hair. So, and there was a different level of experience. He lost his miserliness and his miserableness, and he elevated himself by focusing on the heart. Also, another good example of this general process, we could take A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, or Scrooge, if people have seen the film. So that book identifies a classic mystical experience. So Ebenezer Scrooge goes home and he's in his house. He may have a hypnagogic experience, or he may have had an hallucination, or it may be real. And he meets Marley's ghost, who is his old partner. And Marley is kind of being good, trying to help him to indicate that there's something wrong with his life. So then we have Scrooge, who's taken by the ghosts of Christmas past, present and future. So we have the transcendent of time and space, which is relevant to the mystical experience. And he sees the effect of his behavior, as a person does in a near-death experience. He sees the effect he has on others. And he goes through that process, comes back and realizes what has been wrong with his life and celebrates Christmas thereafter. It's a classic example of a mystical event and the implications it can have, emphasizing that the key value is that compassion. And and Dickens says that even though people didn't really trust, or some people didn't really trust, he didn't care. He smiled afterwards, and he continued to celebrate Christmas. And and people can get the difference between the two characters. It's not difficult to understand.
His heart was opened up.
His heart was opened up, and so this mystical journey can be worked out through a disciplined way. But sometimes particular experiences will accelerate this process. Yeah. So the near-death experience is one of those that can accelerate. And we know that Buddhist meditators can create those things, but they're familiar with the cycle anyway. So people that have been meditating, contemplating in a positive way about other people, their own life, they will begin to move. We have this always idea of a ladder, these symbols, moving up levels. If one does engage in a spiritual quest, one does feel that one is moving up levels. So one has a sense, okay, I understand that this is a different level I'm on. That's a natural process, as well as a specific process in a number of different.
My sense of the spiritual path is that it's possible that it can be joyful from start to finish. For example, the yogis talk about ananda, the sense of bliss.
Yes, yeah.
That accompanies the path. But also from a Freudian perspective, we have the idea of defense mechanisms. If we have quirks in our personality, if we're trying to protect ourselves from seeing ourselves more deeply, we have defense mechanisms. And some people are very well defended. And in that instance where we're not willing, because of our defense mechanisms, to take a joyful path, we're often pushed. If we're on the path, we're pushed into a painful learning situation, which can be very beneficial at the end of the day, but it may break our heart before we learn the lessons that are to be learned.
That's very well put. I couldn't put it better myself, but that's a very profound statement and very true. I would agree with that proposition. What you're suggesting as well is, and this is another important point, a part of the movement from the self to the true self is the transcendence of the ego, and this is where we move on towards. So this is an ongoing process. So it's not that we don't have an ego. We need to have an ego. We need to be able to protect ourselves. We're not meant to become limp, defenseless people that can't throw someone if they attack us, for example. You're entitled to do so, to defend yourself against that. I'm not talking about, but people, we can see that in the Shaolin Temple, for example, the way that martial arts grew out of religious traditions.
Yes.
I've been to the Shaolin Temple. Have you?
Mm-hmm. I have not been to the Shaolin Temple, but you will see here in our home pictures and sculptures of Bodhidharma, the founder.
Yes, yeah. So I'm joking there, but I have done something that you didn't do.
Oh, you've done many things I've never done.
Yes, and the transcendence of the ego, we see this in alchemy. That's what the mirror of the distillation, getting rid of the other things, moving to a higher level. It's working on yourself. So that doesn't go away. So we all have to work on ourselves and test ourselves. And in a Christian sense, I hear some people say, well, I don't understand what that concept of sin is about. They often, we can simply see it in terms of things that are not good for us or for other people, but it's also not good for us to be engaged in certain things. That's what the basic idea is in relation. So the same process is in all religious traditions. So if we take that, we have the self, the true self. We're going on a journey. We're trying to identify what's real and what's not real. And Buddhism is very good on what's illusory and attachment to things that are not true for the path, because we don't want to stop. We don't want to go off on a diversion. We're trying to. I think the French word for entertainment is diversion or diversion. So that's an idea. You're going on your spiritual path, and I say, "Come over here, Jeffrey. Look at what I have to offer." And they say, "Oh, it looks good for a while, but it doesn't satisfy you." So as well as that knowledge and what's not knowledge, and the right type of knowledge. So all the mathematical formulas are fantastic, but it may not give you any spiritual insight. There has to be a context in which knowledge operates, and also revelation through spiritual thing may be is superior in all these traditions to worked out logic for the rational mind, which is a difficult concept to get to.
Now, you used earlier Maslow's notion of the plateau experience. But my sense is that when you're on a spiritual path, it doesn't end. It keeps going and going.
So that's an important point. So the analogy is water. I think water is a classic. And it's no mistake that they use that in baptism or in other traditions, and Taoism is very based on water. They use that. So the idea is that, well, it's not good for water to become a stagnant pool.
Yeah.
So water should flow.
It should flow.
We're always going to be moving. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to know that life can never stay the same. We have to grow. We have to move. Things are changed. We can't hold on. We can't fix. We can't grip onto the present and not let go of it and stop yourself developing, stop other people developing. So yes, it's a movement constantly forward. But as the force gathers water is the softest thing, the Tao Te Ching, but the softness overcomes the hardness. The water will wear away the stone through its own pressure. The same thing with the constant movement of the soft spirit or yin kind of energy, that it begins to create a path, and it may create a path. It may be pathways in the brain that if you want to look at it in those terms, which I'm not bothered about. But the idea then is that the true practice and true affirmation of basic values of compassion and kindness and helping people or service, that the person begins to transcend the ego and to transcend the problems of existence. Now, there's a different emphasis in Buddhism and Christianity. They often represent Buddhism as saying that we should avoid suffering. And if the Buddha said that, I'm not sure I'd agree with it. And I wonder, do we actually get that emphasis correct? Because Christianity has a different view about suffering. My view is that suffering is a nature of this existence, but we have to learn methods to cope with the suffering and to be joyous in overcoming of that.
Yeah, and my sense is when the Buddhists talk about suffering, they don't mean pain.
Yes, yeah.
They, I have heard Buddhist teachers say that, you can be sick, you can be in pain and misery, but not be suffering in your heart.
Yes, that's correct. And so some people don't, that's the correct, that has to be the correct interpretation. So that's very well put. I agree with you. But some people represent things. So it's not as if the Buddhists are retreating from the world but in relation to their spirit is not engaging in practices which will cause suffering to themselves or others. So that's the notion, and that's where they join together.
It's probably worth mentioning that there are academic critics of the postmodern deconstructionist variety who disagree entirely with the notion of the perennial philosophy or the primordial tradition. They say, mystical experiences are ineffable, so that when someone who is a Buddhist describes their experience and someone who is a Christian describes it, we don't even know what they're talking about. Actually, so we can't say that there's a common element.
Yeah. Well, I could begin to deconstruct that statement and say, well, is it really true that they are ineffable? Yeah. So I understand the point, and I use that point, and there's another term, difficult to explain, which is commonly used, which I've used. So the idea that a person can't say anything about the experience is wrong. So
we've been talking about it for some time.
The postmodernist deconstruction, I've no time for a lot of that really. I think it's a waste because you have to accept, unfortunately. Now I'm sure there's great ones out there, so I don't but I'll tell you my honest view. There are a lot of people in academia who have political perspectives and ideological perspectives that are antithetical towards spiritual quests. They may come from particular backgrounds. There is evidence of infiltration to utilize the institution to promote a particular agenda. So they would say that. So what does that leave us with? I mean, you have to look at it from a pragmatic perspective of the consequences of these things. So you see the same thing in Beckett, where the modern thing breaks everything down, breaks it down, deconstructs it, and there's nothing left. It's like when you're a child. Well, I remember getting a car from my father. It was great. And then you open it up because you want to see what's inside, and you break it to get inside. You want to see how it's made. And then by the time you have deconstructed it, there's nothing left. You can't put it back together again. So if they help people out in the world to deal with their spiritual challenges, that's grand, but a lot of them won't do. And there's also, I see a deconstruction of the very idea of self. And I see that as, by some psychologists and philosophers, I see that as a very bad and negative direction. And I see it as related to the scientific agenda, which wants to dehumanize people, to take away that idea that they are superior to their physical form and that there is something less. So they go together. So some of these higher level things sounds very impressive. It sounds very learned. It sounds very clever, but it's not very wise, and it's not going to help people. That's a generalization, but in relation to the type of thing I'm thinking about.
Yeah. On the positive side,
because
everything usually has a positive side. I think some of these deconstructionists they look at some people who view the perennial tradition as establishing a spiritual hierarchy with the great white leaders at the top, the Great White Brotherhood, and then at the very bottom are these indigenous people practicing voodoo and black magic and the dark arts, and they say no, indigenous spirituality is just as valuable.
Oh yes, I have the greatest respect for indigenous spirituality. it's not all the same, but you have to be careful because the traditions, say, for example, of the people here in New Mexico, the native peoples, may not be the same as a tribe somewhere else. And on other standards, we can't glorify all traditional behavior. There's loads of traditional behavior that we don't have to tolerate or accept, whatever. But in relation to the idea that they're bad per se, that's obviously wrong. And there is a great spiritual wisdom among the native peoples of North and South America and of other peoples around the world. So we have to be very careful. But it doesn't mean that we can't say that, and particularly there's a lot of legal cases about cultural practices in America when people come from different countries where it was their religious practice but it offends against the law here. Of course, if it comes to the United States, people have to abide by U.S. laws. So there are ways to accommodate that difference. But I don't believe, in fact, it's kind of the opposite in some ways, that if you look at the amount of people that are interested in going to South America for ayahuasca experiences with shaman from the tribes, that it's privilege, or it's putting the other way around, it's putting the shamanism,
that also happens. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here. There's obviously, these are conversations that can go on for 10,000 years. There's so much more to say. And fortunately, you're going to be here with me in Albuquerque yet another day. I want to have more conversations with you. I want to look at the dark side of mysticism.
Can I finish one point just to finish? The last point I wanted to mention is that through persistent practices, I have an idea that we create what I call the nexus to the numinous. That people who practice the mystical thing create, as it were, a bigger connection to a higher reality. And I think if you look at the Pantheon in Rome, there's a hole in the top. So you have the gods, but there's a hole in the top. And it's the dome, it's the skull. It's reflecting the idea that there's always you create a connection to the higher world. You see that in the Duomo, which is again the dome of the skull, in say Florence, in Brunelleschi's Duomo. You can go up the steps behind, so you arrive at the top, so you can see the panorama all around. So that reflects the fact that people who engage in the path eventually come to a stage where they are open to that peaceful zone, which keeps them going over the long. So that's the kind of end route.
And I'm under the impression that people on the path, in a way, are like trailblazers that help open a route for other people to follow. Which you have certainly done. I want to, for our viewers, recommend your book very highly. The Mystical Accord. It's a wonderful piece of scholarship and poetry, but it's more than just poetry, as you refer to them, sutras.
Yes, yeah.
It's really a work of inspiration.
I really appreciate your kind comments. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you for being with me, and for our viewers who have come this far. This is our 4th interview. I hope to do a couple more with you while you're here in Albuquerque, James.
Looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you for being with us.